Between 1200 and 1150 BC, almost every major civilization on Earth collapsed. Not declined, not weakened, collapsed. The Mycenaean Greeks, gone. The Hittite Empire, gone. Ugarit, one of the most important trade cities in the ancient world, burned to the ground and never rebuilt. Cyprus, destroyed. The palace systems of the entire Eastern Mediterranean ended in a single generation. It's called the Bronze Age collapse, and it remains one of the most debated catastrophes in all of human history. For decades, the explanation was simple. The Sea Peoples did it. These mysterious raiders, referenced in Egyptian records, supposedly swept across the Mediterranean like a wave, burning everything in their path. Rameses III claimed to have fought them off at the Battle of the Delta around 1175 BC, and the temple walls at Medinet Habu show scenes of the battle. Strange-looking warriors in feathered helmets fighting from ships. The Sea Peoples became the ancient world's go-to villain. Need to explain why a palace was burned? Sea Peoples. Need to explain why a city was abandoned? Sea Peoples. But the actual evidence for the Sea Peoples as a unified, organized force is thin. The Egyptian texts don't give us a homeland. The feathered helmets in the carvings don't match any known culture with certainty. And the timeline doesn't fully add up. Several of the major collapse sites show signs of destruction that predate the Sea People raids described in Egyptian records. So archaeologists started digging deeper. Literally, what they found in the soil layers was a story much messier than a foreign invasion. Start with the drought. Paleoclimate research, pollen cores, lake sediment samples, isotope analysis shows a prolonged and severe drought hit the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BC. Not a bad year. A multi-decade dry period. Brandon Drake at the University of New Mexico published analysis showing the eastern Mediterranean became significantly drier right at the moment of collapse. In a region where agriculture was the foundation of palace economies, that's catastrophic. Then add earthquake storms. The geologist Amos Nur documented something unusual in the archaeological record. Multiple major sites show evidence of earthquake destruction within a relatively short period. Mycenae, Tiryns, Ugarit, Megiddo, Hazor. If you get several major seismic events in a 50-year window, the cumulative effect on interconnected trade networks could be devastating. Now layer in the system fragility. The Bronze Age palace economies were deeply interdependent. Cyprus produced copper. The Hittites and Anatolians supplied tin. Egypt had grain. Ugarit was the broker between them. This worked spectacularly well for 2 centuries. But that interconnection was also a vulnerability. When one piece failed, the whole network felt it. A modern economist would call it a supply chain crisis. When the drought hit, grain production fell. When earthquakes damaged ports, trade slowed. When trade slowed, the bronze that armies needed became harder to produce. When armies couldn't be equipped, palace authority weakened. When palace authority weakened, internal rebellions became possible. And when the system started visibly failing, the migrations began, populations fleeing their own collapsing societies, moving into the territories of their neighbors. Those migrants are probably who the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples, not a military force, a refugee crisis. The most recent scholarship treats the collapse as a perfect storm: drought, earthquakes, disrupted trade, internal rebellions, and population displacement, all hitting within the same 50-year window. No single cause. A cascading failure in a system that had no resilience because it had never needed any. Ugarit is the one that stays with me. In the ruins of Ugarit, archaeologists found a clay tablet that was never fired, meaning it was still wet, still in the kiln when the city was destroyed. It's a letter from the king of Ugarit to the king of Alashia in Cyprus. He writes that enemy ships have been spotted, that his infantry and chariotry are away in Hittite territory, that he has no troops to send. He asks for help. The reply never came. The letter sat in an unfinished kiln for 3,200 years. The Bronze Age ended not in a single battle, but in a series of letters that stopped being replied to. To understand why the Bronze Age collapse matters beyond ancient history, you need to understand just how integrated the Bronze Age world had become. By 1300 BC, the Eastern Mediterranean was operating something close to a global economy. Not global in the modern sense, but the degree of specialization and interdependence was extraordinary for the pre-industrial world. Consider what went into making a single bronze sword in, say, Mycenaean Greece around 1250 BC. The copper came from Cyprus. The tin came from somewhere in the distant east, possibly Afghanistan, possibly Cornwall in Britain, possibly both at different times. Historians still debate the tin routes. The ore was smelted into ingots, loaded onto merchant ships, carried across hundreds of kilometers of open sea, traded at ports like Ugarit or Byblos, then carried overland or by river to workshops in Greece or Anatolia or Egypt, where smiths with specialized knowledge turned it into bronze and then into weapons. That sword in a Mycenaean warrior's hand represented the coordinated labor of miners, smelters, merchants, sailors, middlemen, and smiths spread across half the known world. Now imagine what happens when any link in that chain breaks. When the Cypriot copper mines were disrupted, and we have evidence they were, in this period, bronze production across the entire Eastern Mediterranean felt it. When the Aegean trade routes became dangerous, whether from raiders, storms, or political instability, the flow of tin slowed. When the Hittite Empire, which controlled much of the overland route through Anatolia, began to fracture, the whole trade network lost a critical node. This is why the collapse, when it came, was so total and so fast. Modern economic modeling of the Bronze Age system suggests it had what complexity theorists call high connectivity and low resilience. It worked brilliantly under normal conditions. It was catastrophic when stressed. The recovery took centuries. The Iron Age that followed the Bronze Age collapse was, paradoxically, in many ways a step backward. Iron is more abundant than bronze. You can find iron ore almost everywhere, unlike tin, which is rare. But early iron tools and weapons were actually inferior to good bronze ones. The Iron Age didn't replace bronze because iron was better. It replaced bronze because bronze became unavailable. The scribal tradition collapsed too. Linear B, the writing system used by the Mycenaean Greeks, disappeared with the palaces that had maintained it. Greece entered what historians call the Greek Dark Ages, roughly 400 years with no writing, dramatically reduced trade, smaller populations, and simpler material culture. When writing reappeared in Greece around 800 BC, it was a completely different system, the Phoenician-derived alphabet. The knowledge encoded in Linear B was gone. Whatever records the Mycenaean palace administrators had kept, lists of goods, names of gods, records of kings, vanished with the tablets. We have some of those tablets excavated from Mycenaean sites, but they're administrative records, not literature. We have no Mycenaean epics, no Mycenaean theology, no Mycenaean history written by Mycenaeans themselves. It was all gone before anyone thought to preserve it. The Iliad and the Odyssey, composed centuries after the Bronze Age ended, from oral traditions that had survived the Dark Ages, are our main literary window into that vanished world. And even Homer was working from memory and myth, not from records. What's striking about the Bronze Age collapse in the end is how thoroughly it erased the memory of what had come before. The Hittites were forgotten so completely that 19th century historians thought they were mythical. The Mycenaean Greeks were remembered only through legend. Ugarit sat undiscovered for 3 millennia. The whole interconnected Bronze Age world went dark, and when the lights came back on in the Iron Age, almost no one remembered it had existed. That's the thing about civilizational collapse. It doesn't just destroy the present, it destroys the past, too. The clay tablets that survived, fired in the kilns by the very fires that destroyed the cities, are almost the only voices left from that world. The letter from Ugarit's king, still asking for help. The administrative lists from Mycenae, the diplomatic correspondence from Hattusa, they survived because they were clay. Everything written on papyrus, on wood, on leather, all of it gone. The Bronze Age speaks to us only through its most durable materials. Everything else burned.